Everything Everywhere All at Once is a masterpiece in absurdist filmmaking about a woman named Evelyn, whose life is hanging on by a thread. She is on the verge of losing not only her business, her husband, but more importantly than all of that, her daughter. Throughout the course of the rather large runtime, the storytellers utilized the absurdist genre to explore many profound emotions that people can experience in times of crisis. The kind of realizations and self-growth that people have to go through that do not happen overnight, but are the result of time, the result of us processing and considering the environment and people around us, and coming to conclusions about our own happiness, the state of the world, and what we truly believe in. I absolutely loved Everything Everywhere All at Once, and one of the reasons I found it to be so profound and speak to me on such a vibrant level was its utilization of the absurd. Absurdism is a genre that essentially bulks at the idea that there has to be rhyme, reason, or logic for certain elements of your storytelling. Of course, absurdism comes on a pretty severe spectrum. Many movies or books utilize small bits of absurdism here or there to add humor or just justify small plot beats to help them get from point A to B. The Harry Potter franchise often has absurdist moments with its own magic system, often to provide levity or character building beats. But it is by no means an absurdist story. While you can find examples of tinges of absurdism in countless stories such as the Dresden Files, my personal favorite examples of the genre are the stories that are unafraid to bring it into their very core and utilize the absurd to examine the emotions, the feelings that make us ludicrously human. But that narrative choice can be a double-edged sword. Because while it can be incredibly fun to start introducing elements to your story like Douglas Adams does, where there's just these strange facts and bits of fiction that definitely pull in your reader and make them go, what? At the same time, an overabundance can undercut stakes or any feeling of narrative weight. Worst of all, things that are pointlessly absurd can feel childish or just like a waste of time. Do you see how this purposeless joke was just kind of distracting? That's the weight of absurdism. But in a truly masterful hand, that can even kind of be the point of it. And that's where the title of this video comes into play. The complex beauty of absurdism is something that is always going to give and take. And I want to really talk about its most successful achievements in some pretty notable entries. First and foremost with the story we opened with, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I'm not going to get into spoilers for this film. It is still in theaters and I highly recommend you go see it. For a brief review, I would give it a 9 out of 10, and that's for largely the reasons we're going to talk about now. Everything Everywhere All at Once utilizes absurdism to provide, yes, fantastic humor, but often represent and show a literal interpretation of the emotions, anxiety, and stress that is within the characters we are experiencing this story with. Absurdism, if it's done properly over the runtime of an entire movie or throughout the entire page count of an entire book, can make something that we cannot put into words become universally understood. And that was the point to Everything Everywhere All at Once. It is incredibly hard for us as people to bring forth some of our deeper, more complex emotions and state them directly. Even some of the most poetic writers of all time struggle with the deeper, darker thoughts that exist within us. This film was able to showcase a complex relationship between mother and daughter and the growing void between them, and make every single viewer of the film who is paying attention understand the complexities of coming out to your parent, of accepting your daughter for being different, the cultural gap that can exist generationally, and the struggle of communication that can happen when people are brought up in two different environments. All of this without ever being directly stated is addressed and made literal within the film. And because of the movie's incredibly deep tie to having emotion drive what is absurd, it's able to accomplish all of this without ever losing the actual stakes of the story. Things feel dangerous, things feel threatening because the absurd is used lethally. Just as our own emotions as we're growing, evolving, and changing can become quite frightening, this is the absurd utilized to actually be a threat. Until we are able to address address our emotions and become comfortable with the changes we experience no matter our age, a literal interpretation of what we're feeling would be terrifying. But once you understand the other, once you understand where those emotions are coming from and why, then all of a sudden it becomes much more relatable, much more interpretable.
This very point is why I think there's going to be a pretty much 100% overlap between people who really enjoy Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and Everything Everywhere All at Once. Both of them are utilizing absurd to explore emotions, while Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is going into the emotions of a teenager who is smitten and delving into the complexities and the riling internal hormones of someone of that age. Everything Everywhere All at Once is using the absurd to explore someone who's very frightened by the world around them and the changes in the life that didn't turn out the way they did. It's an extremely similar approach to the genre, just executing a remarkably different story. And their stylization I actually found to be ringing in a similar-ish vein, although not exactly the same. Definitely if you're a Scott Pilgrim fan, check out Everything Everywhere All at Once.
But bouncing away from that movie, let's look at actually a piece of literature, maybe the most famous usage of absurdism in all of science fiction, and that's going to be Douglas Adams' masterwork, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Absurdist stuff tends to like long titles. One of the greatest feats of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, in my humble opinion, is presenting an extraordinarily nihilistic view of the universe around the author, the narrator, the perspective, but at the same time, it's not exactly a sad or painful universe to digest. In fact, the lack of purpose and absurdity of it provides almost a sense of comfort and safety for the reader. Yes, nothing matters, but that means the characters are able to find their own way. Governments and species are constantly bogged down by bureaucracy, but the individual is immensely free and able to explore and experience and interpret this complex, beautiful universe that we do not even have the tools to fully experience ourselves as organisms. And you can't help but read this material and interpret Douglas Adams' own view of the universe as immensely empty, but also extraordinarily beautiful. The initiating incident within this story is layered in just simple bureaucratic issues affecting a person, but at the end of the day, the end of the story, none of it even remotely matters, and that's kind of the point. A man's going to lose his home due to some highway zoning, but then all of a sudden he loses his actual planet and has to accept the incredibly large and terrifying universe that does not care about him. This touches on a fear I think nearly every single person has had in their life, where they look out into the black void above them and begins to process just how insignificant they are. Insignificant does not even feel like a good enough word. You do not register on the scale of significance. Even the most important humans in the history of our species are actually not that important or important at all in the cosmic grand scale of things, when everything they've ever done can be wiped out by a black hole spiraling into our galaxy at any given moment. That feeling of dread is where Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy finds so much playfulness in the absurdism it brings forth. This brings me finally into my personal favorite absurdist stories ever written by the mastermind Terry Pratchett, Discworld. Discworld does pretty much everything we've already touched on here and oh so much more. Terry Pratchett's most famous accomplishment as an author, and one that is so fun and lighthearted, yet at the same time deep enough that nearly every single fan who I've met who's come across these stories says it has changed them on a very deep and significant level. He personified death. Terry Pratchett used the absurd to take one of the most terrifying things that every single living being on this planet must confront at some point, the end of their life, and he made it maybe the most relatable character I have read in my life. Death has anxiety. He goes through a midlife crisis. He's not vindictive or evil. He's doing a job, and that is such a refreshing interpretation of the most common fear shared among humanity. Later on in Terry Pratchett's career, he apparently began receiving letters from fans who are on their deathbeds, terminally ill, and they would tell him how grateful they were for his interpretation of death, how when they died, they hoped the death they met was something like the character he crafted, something so relatable in its existential dread. It's almost an anti-Lovecraftian. It's not that we can't understand it, it's that we're so afraid of what's being presented to us that we don't see what is relatable about it. And Terry Pratchett made death relatable. Yes, it's absurd, it's not going to be the reality of the situation, but in a genre where you reject the idea that just because nothing matters, it's comforting, it provides peace, and that's, to me, one of the foundational pillars of absurdism. And that is just one example of why I believe Discworld is peak absurdism in so many ways. Yes, there's the famous example of death, but there's also what Terry Pratchett accomplished with his Witches series, where he took characters that are typically viewed as horrific elements, villains, schemers, and justified, and provided reasons for their position in society. City Watch took characters that are often the most forgotten and flooded them with philosophical contradictions and over-the-top personalities so that they stick in your head more than just about any other normal fantasy protagonist who doesn't have a job that most authors forget about. Whether you're helping everyone understand a shared emotion we can't quite put into words, but like Everything Everywhere All at Once did, scream we're still human just because we cannot communicate it does not mean we do not feel it, or you're poking fun at the gigantic black void we all float in like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or finally you're taking the most common fear humans share and making it just a little bit less scary. Absurdism is a box of tools that, when utilized right, can accomplish something that no other genre can. At least not without an insane amount of work that wouldn't make, quite frankly, as good a story. Putting it as simply as I can, absurdism is maybe the most efficient tool in a storyteller's box to take many parts of the human experience that are so hard to fully emotionally process or logically understand and distill them down into shareable, concise stories that allow all of us to point at something and go, this. We all understand this. And that's what this whole video is going towards. These are brilliant stories. I am going to be thinking about Everything Everywhere All at Once for as long as I have been thinking about Hitchhikers or Discworld, because it was profound for me. I have often been bogged down by my own anxieties in these deep feelings of voids and gaps between me and others, generational differences, my own coming out of the closet, and the lack of understanding from many of the people I felt around me. Seeing a perspective from them that was presented so human, while it's not necessarily one I agree with or one that I can understand, helped. And Discworld has made me far less afraid of things I do not understand. Hitchhikers has made me so much more comfortable with the existential fear I used to be plagued with when I realized I was not a particularly religious person. Stories matter, and brilliant story writers can change lives. I have heard many people say that the absurdist genre is just not for them because they cannot get into it, which, despite everything I just said, I very much so understand. Truly absurdist stories like The Little Prince even are kind of hard to become invested in. If you're trying to connect with characters or maybe the potential threat of a villain, it's not really going to be the same experience you often get with like The Lord of the Rings or First Law. What I'm going to ask for you, the viewer, if you're someone who hasn't actually invested in absurdist stories before, please give it another shot, and don't go into it expecting to be on the edge of your seat, biting your nails, afraid for the characters. Instead, try and put yourself in the character's shoes and think back on some of those emotions you've had, because every single time I have personally found an absurdist story to be as well crafted as the ones I have just listed, it has impacted me more than any book outside the genre. It's about that emotion you can't quite express. It's about that frustration you can't quite pinpoint. So instead, you tell a story about it. Absurdism thrives in examining raw emotion. Go see Everything Everywhere All at Once. It is truly just as good as the internet is hyping it up to be, which is not something I very often say. It's my new personal favorite A24 film, and they have several films I consider damn near perfect. But this was just my love letter to absurdism, a genre that has not necessarily made me change my beliefs, but at repeated occasions has made me more comfortable with the beliefs that I have due to finding storytellers who clearly are sending a message that is at least interpretable in a way on an emotional level that I just needed to hear. That's it. That's the video. The complex beauty of absurdism. I promise you'll take something different away from it than I did. Anyway, everyone, like and subscribe if you have not already, and hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. Have a good one, y'all. Bye!